Our summer preaching series is the Psalms of Summer, and I chose Psalm 22. It's long and it's complex, and that's why I thought it might be helpful for you to have it printed so that you could follow it along as a portion of it was read earlier in the service. Just be glad it's not the 119th. It has 176 verses. But at any rate, I'd like to ask that you find that insert and keep it a little handy because I'm going to refer to it a bit later. You see, I'm the teaching minister and I get to have handouts. I think it's a rule. The Psalms of Summer. We thought it was a catchy title, but what did you think when you heard it? Perhaps you thought a summer of syrupy sermons, a summer of comforting concepts, a summer of pious poetry. I wondered about that, and I wondered what the Psalms of Summer might have communicated to you. I suspect that the book of Psalms is mentioned, and the minds of most of you jump in several directions. Perhaps you go to Psalm 23, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." Or Psalm 100, "Make a joyful noise unto the Lord, all the earth." Or Psalm 90, "Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations." Or the inspiring psalm that turned the heart of Martin Luther to write his magnificent hymn, Psalm 46, "God is our refuge and strength." This collection of poetry, known to us as the Book of Psalms, is in reality an incredible body of writing. It is a collection that is recognized in the secular world as great poetry. It is a collection that speaks to Christians and Jews as great spiritual truth. It is a collection that contains works that have sustained countless people in their times of crisis. The well-known Russian Jewish activist Nitin Sharansky was imprisoned in the Gulag of Soviet Union in 1977. His request to emigrate to Israel was finally granted in 1996. The story is told that when the guards came to remove him from his cell, he refused to leave until they allowed him to take with him the Book of Psalms that had been his companion throughout his grueling incarceration of 9 years. Kathleen Norris, one of my favorite writers, commented on Sharansky's gesture, and I quote, "In an age that despises the holy, or alternately trivializes it with relentlessly cute greeting card angels, Sharansky's act may seem utterly incomprehensible." Dr. Peter Gomes, the minister of Harvard's prestigious Memorial Church, is frequently asked, he says, by members of the community of this august institution of higher education, "How do I begin to read the Scriptures? I've really never read the Bible before," they often want to say. Well, not surprisingly, he regularly recommends that they begin with the Psalms. He tells of having told one woman one day, about to undergo surgery for cancer, to sit down and read the book of Psalms straight through from beginning to end. In one sitting, if possible, he suggested. Well, having done so, she reflected on the experience a day or so later when they met, and she said that she had no idea how the psalmist knew who she was, her precise condition, what her emotions were, what her needs were. He quotes her as saying, "When he rejoiced, so did I, and when he howled and cried out, I did too." She discovered, Gomes comments, that she was not alone, but rather that she was invited into a relationship with a voice other than her own through an ancient book of worship and hymnody and poetry that came to seem like a friend who knew her to the core of her being. For me, the Psalms are blessedly untidy. They are an ancient and a new. They are personal and they are communal. And to again quote Kathleen Norris, the God that one encounters in the Psalms is God as human beings have experienced him as both awake and asleep, gloriously present and lamentably absent, and above all, varies. She goes on, God can be a warrior who stands up for us, a mother who holds us to her breast, an eagle sheltering us under her wing, a creator who brings forth lightning, wind, and rain from the storehouses of heaven. And I end her quote. A member of the Benedictine order, Sebastian Moore, has observed that God behaves in the Psalms in ways that he's not allowed to behave in systematic theology. Now, that's a bit of humor that might pass you by if you've never studied systematic theology, but it tells us of a God who is so very real that people get angry, that people feel lost, that people feel separated and alone, as well as feeling shepherded and encouraged and sustained and nourished. Well, today we turn to yet another of the Psalms, number 22, a psalm that seems to me to be a kind of look back through one of life's darkest hours. Find the copy of the psalm that you have. It was included in your order of worship, and have it in hand because I'll ask you to look at it in a moment. I want to begin by sharing with you one of my own pastoral stories in an effort to flesh out some of the meaning of this psalm. It occurred yesterday morning as I sat for about an hour talking with the members of a family who were facing one of life's darkest hours, the difficult decision surrounding the medical treatment of a much-loved family member experiencing deteriorating health. Decisions need to be made, difficult life and death decisions. It's indeed a dark hour for them. It was difficult for them, as it is always difficult for all of us, to see through the darkness of crisis. At times like these, we simply have to put one foot in front of another, one step at a time, never quite sure where our feet will land as we take each step. It is a frightening time, and it is difficult to move forward. The fear is not a lack of faith. It is at times like that that the words of Psalm 22 can help us. Take a look at the simple outline of Psalm 22 that you have in your hands. This is clearly not written in the moment of crisis. It comes from the hand of someone who has survived a dark hour and who writes from the other side of crisis, looking back through it. It is a psalm that can help us as we step into our dark moments. And the first thing that this psalmist does is to affirm that sense of being alone in the darkness of crisis. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from helping me? From the words of my groaning, oh my God, I cry by day, but you do not answer, and by night, but find no rest. How familiar that feeling must be to so many of us in this room, for it is the very nature of crisis to feel it as our peculiar and particular experience. And to be truthful, they always are. No one is there with us in our moment of crisis. No one shares what we feel, not even other family members who are walking the road with us in the health crisis of a parent or a beloved relative. We all feel our crises differently. And for the person who faces their own mortality, their own illness, their own pain, the sense of aloneness is profound. I can remember spending 10 days in cardiac intensive care back in May of 1987. I was surrounded by a devoted family and treated by skilled cardiologists who were on the cutting edge of their profession. I was very fortunate to have them. I was cared for every minute by highly trained ICU nursing staff. Every function of my body was displayed on a monitor that would sound an alarm at the slightest indication of an abnormality. I should have felt overwhelmingly confident and secure, but what I felt was a creeping and growing fear. And it wasn't a fear of dying. It was the fear of being a cardiac invalid the rest of my life inhibited by a chronically limited heart, and no one could share that fear with me, not even the people closest to me. The sense of aloneness and abandonment was profound. Some weeks later, when the crisis was over, the fear lingered during cardiac rehab, and it was then that I began reading my Bible on the days when I was at home alone, and it was Psalm 22 that spoke to that fear. For in the third verse of the psalmist's writings, he moves beyond that sense of profound fear and abandonment and looks to the history of the broader community and remembers. And he remembers God's presence in the history of Israel. It was in that verse that I began to feel comfort and hope. You are holy, he writes, enthroned in the praises of Israel, in our ancestors' trust. They trusted, and you delivered them. To you they cried and were saved. In you they trusted and were not put to shame. Looking back through one of life's darkest hours, the psalmist moves from being someone locked in the chains of fear and hopelessness and begins to grasp for an emerging sense of hope, a hope that has come down through the history of a whole people. It is a movement from a profound sense of being alone into the liberating awareness that one's life is in fact lived in the context of a larger history, the history of our ancestors. For the writer of Psalm 22, those ancestors were men and women who found courage and hope in their faith, in the presence of God, in the moments of life's darkest hours. I once heard hope defined as the consciousness that this moment is not the end. For Israel, hope is indeed the consciousness that this moment is not the end. Israel constantly looks to the Exodus as proof of God's presence in crisis. As the people of Israel stood on the shore of the Red Sea, they were afraid, and they felt abandoned by God as the troops of Pharaoh began rumbling towards them. Then one of them stepped forward into the unknown of the future, a future beyond slavery, a future out into the unknown of the wilderness, a future that would lead them to a promised land and a new life. Some stood in fear and thought of turning back to Egypt because even though they were bound for the limitations of slavery if they went back, they reasoned they would at least have a place to live and food. But those who stepped forward into the unknown did so because they had a sense of hope, and their sense was rooted in the faith and awareness that this moment is not the end. Indeed, the ends of some things or some realities are surely at hand at a moment of crisis. But the writer of the Psalms portrays what God has in mind for all of history if you read further. And the history of Israel has borne out that God has more in mind than that fearful moment with the water lapping at their feet. Well, I'd like to invite you into two recent experiences that happened just this past summer and a third one that is occurring right now. This past summer, a number of us journeyed on a kind of a pilgrimage to Europe, a trip that began by attending the Oberammergau Passion Play. It is a summer-long performance run that takes place in a small Bavarian village near the Austrian border. Now, the Passion Play is surrounded by controversy, and perhaps you've read some of that in articles in the paper in recent months and weeks. But that aside, it is the inspiring fulfillment of a vow made by the ancestors of today's villagers way back in 1633. It was a vow that they made as an act of praise and thanksgiving to God for having been spared the scourge of the then rampant bubonic plague. The play dramatizes that last week in the life of Jesus, beginning with Palm Sunday and running through the resurrection. The scene of the agony of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane was wrenching to watch. The crucifixion scene was even more so. It is in that scene that Jesus speaks the opening words of Psalm 22 from the cross. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? This is a direct quote from the gospel accounts. Jesus was a Jew, and the Psalms were his scriptures. No doubt he knew the entire text of Psalm 22. He knew its full message and must have moved through that darkest hour with that full message in his heart. This was not a cry of despair. Painful and awful as was the agony of the crucifixion, our Lord seems to be inviting us into the entire message of this psalm to carry us through our painful and awful and agonizing moments. Turn to your copy again and move down to the end of the psalm, beginning with verse 27. Here the psalmist's poetic expression of a faith in a God who looks to the whole of human history, of which we are but a small part at any given moment. Here the psalmist proclaims a faith in the God who reigns over all of creation in all time. And in verse 30 he writes, "Posterity will serve him, future generations will be told about the Lord and proclaim his deliverance to a people yet unborn." Difficult as it is for us to see beyond our moment of crisis, Psalm 22 is inviting us to do just that, and to grasp on to a sense of hope in the face of the unknown, to see our moment of crisis in the totality of human history. The second illustration I would share with you picks up on as our trip continued beyond the Oberammergau Passion Play. A number of us went on to an extension to Berlin to see the incredible rebuilding of that city. It's a forest of cranes, and I stood there wishing I had stock in crane companies. But one afternoon, 4 of us boarded a local train to the suburban community of Sachsenhausen on the north side of the city, the site of one of the early Nazi concentration camps during World War II. I was struck by the proximity of the town to the site of the camp, separated only by streets with houses on one side and the camp walls on the other. It was a hot day, and when we walked into the memorial grounds, the sun was beating down upon us. Our first stop was the exhibition hall to view the display that told about the terrible story of this place. We learned that it was one of the first of such camps and that its population was quite diverse. There were Jews and political prisoners, but it was also the main camp for the imprisonment and the extermination of homosexuals, who, like all other inmates, were ultimately exterminated and their bodies cremated into the anonymity of white ashes. We then walked out into the camp itself, void of most of the former structures, with only the rows of foundations of the barracks that once housed prisoners in crude bunks that were lined only with straw and that were crawling with lice and vermin. Near the back of the camp, we came to the crematorium, where the rusted remains of the furnaces were sheltered under a tin-roofed canopy. As we peered through the fence at the haunting sight, I took out my Bible and I read from Psalm 22. It was verses 6 through 11 that we found especially poignant. "But I am a worm and not human, scorned by others and despised by the people. All who see me mock at me, they make mouths at me, they shake their heads. Commit your cause to the Lord, let him deliver. Let him rescue the one in whom he delights. Yet it was you who took me from the womb. You kept me safe in my mother's breast. On you I was cast from my birth, and since my mother bore me, you have been my God. Do not be far from me, for trouble is near, and there is no one to help." What an awful moment in history that was. I'm now about to enter into some controversial territory, and I do so with a degree of anxiety. I'm going to attempt to do it carefully and in a way that will not take undue or inappropriate advantage of the privilege of this pulpit to which I have been called by you as a pastor and a teacher and a spiritual leader. I hold the pulpit to be a privileged and sacred place. I sense myself in the pulpit to be charged with the responsibility to all of you but also charged with a responsibility to be faithful to the gospel as best I understand it, and to the God whom I sense has called me into the ordained ministry of the Christian faith. And I enter this territory because I think it raises a question that responsible Christian communities have to raise today, and that is the question, to what extent might we contribute to the sense of abandonment many people feel and experience in our society today? And here is the situation. 2 weeks ago, I received in the mail from the Department of Outreach and Advocacy of the Episcopal Diocese of Minnesota a letter. It is a letter that inside is addressed to leaders and members of Minnesota's faith communities. It was undoubtedly a broad blanket mailing throughout the state. This letter calls our attention to the fact that one of our local TV stations, and I will not identify it from the pulpit, it is an affiliate of one of the three major networks, ABC, CBS, NBC, that this station will begin this fall to air a new TV talk show hosted by a nationally known and controversial host, and again, I will not use names. This particular host uses the title or label of doctor, inferring credentials in psychiatry and psychology, when in fact the letter tells us the PhD degree that this person holds is in physiology, which is not a behavioral science. This particular host is frequently heard berating anyone stepping outside of what is called, by this host's definition, traditional gender roles, including single mothers and mothers who are either professionals or who work outside of the home, saying that they, and I quote, nauseate and sicken me, they destroy the sanctity of motherhood. The host in question also calls gay and lesbian persons biological errors and deviants, and claims that, quote, a huge proportion, unquote, of gay men are sexual predators, ignoring the fact that the larger proportion of sexual predatory cases in this country involve heterosexual men. Now, I raise this issue to you because it is that kind of language and those attitudes that feed human prejudices and imply approval for sexism, gay bashing, and even the murders of young men like Matthew Shepard, who was brutally beaten and left to die on a rural road 2 years ago. And despite any of our own personal feelings or sentiments toward the issue of homosexuality, or women working outside of the home, or single mothers, or other issues championed by this particular talk show host, this kind of rhetoric on the air in our community is cause for concern. This kind of language seriously endangers the civility of a community's life as it attempts to live in the diversity and in the plurality that is so much a part of our nation today. This is not a freedom of speech issue. This is an issue of incivility and bigotry and language that is capable of inciting and condoning violence and prejudicial behavior against many groups of people. If you want the details about this in our community, I'll share them with you privately by calling me at the office, but please don't ask me this morning at the door. This issue took me back to Sachsenhausen. As I stood at the fence and gazed at the rusting crematory furnaces there, I thought of young Matthew Shepard and all people oppressed by prejudice and bigotry. I realized that as extreme as the concentration camps of Nazi Germany were, they are the ultimate end toward which prejudice and bigotry can take us. And we dare not ever forget that. The late Dr. Martin Niemöller, a pastor in Germany during World War II, was a frequent visitor to the campus of Eden Seminary when I was a student. He preached a sermon in our chapel one Wednesday morning and said, "They came for the gypsies and I said nothing. They came for the homosexuals and I turned my head. They came for political opponents and I ignored them. They came for the Jews and I spoke not a word. And then they came for me." The psalmist wrote, "But I am a worm and not human, scorned by others and despised by people. All who see me mock me. They make mouths at me, they shake their heads. The moment we dehumanize anyone with racist jokes or sexist jokes or age-denigrating jokes or homophobic jokes or anti-Semitic jokes or any bigoted rhetoric, we are but a few steps away from the horrors of history's worst moments, and we create whole groups of people who are forsaken and who are forgotten and who feel that even God has turned aside. God calls the church, and that's you and me, to order ourselves in a way that tells us all in life's darkest hours that God has not forsaken anyone. God calls the church to stand as God's presence to those in the world that feel forgotten and who stand in the forefront of an ever-changing world, or people whom the world calls different. And who are they? Well, we all know them. There is no point in listing them. In conclusion, I would suggest to you that Psalm 22 proclaims to us a number of things. It calls us to our own personal faith, but it also calls us to a sense of corporate responsibility. It clearly proclaims to us that entrusting one's life to the God proclaimed in the Hebrew Scriptures, and surely we can add the God that Jesus came to proclaim, changes everything. For instance, life can be understood not as a frantic self-satisfaction and search for self-security, but a matter of dependence upon God. Suffering can be understood not as something to be avoided at all costs, but as something to be accepted, even embraced on behalf of others, with the knowledge that God shares the suffering of the afflicted. It tells us that the God Jesus proclaims asks us to examine the socially defined norms that we cherish to see if they are indeed in keeping with God's grace and acceptance. And finally, it tells us that even death can be understood not as the ultimate insult to human sovereignty, but as something to be entrusted to God with the assurance that nothing in all creation can separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus our Lord. Amen.